Sunlight dances on the turquoise waters of a hidden bay in Madagascar, illuminating a scene that defies the brutal realities of the 17th century. A crew of pirates, comprised of deserters, freed people, and social outcasts, raises a pure white flag over their newly constructed haven. They gather under a banner dedicated to God and liberty, vowing to abandon the injustices of the world they left behind. In this legendary enclave, former captives are instantly transformed into comrades, and a ship's captain can be voted out of power just as quickly as he was elected. It sounds like the stuff of swashbuckling fiction, and indeed, it might be. This is the tale of Libertalia, a purported pirate utopia said to have arisen in the late 1600s. For centuries, its story has captivated imaginations with promises of radical freedom and equality on the high seas. But how much of Libertalia was real, and how much was simply wishful thinking? To find the answer, we must explore what Libertalia was purported to be, and what historians have to say about whether this pirate paradise ever truly existed. The legend of Libertalia begins with a man named Captain James Misson. According to the lore, Misson was a French naval officer from Provence. He was a man of education, an adventurous spirit, and a strong sense of justice. His transformation from a servant of the crown to a radical pirate purportedly began in Rome. While on shore leave, Misson was said to have been appalled by the decadence and hypocrisy of the papal court. It was there that he met a disillusioned Dominican priest named Caraccioli. This former priest became the intellectual engine behind the Libertalia myth. Caraccioli argued passionately that every man was born free, and that the extreme inequality plaguing Europe was a direct violation of natural law. He convinced Misson that the divine right of kings and the institution of slavery were man-made horrors that defied God's divine will. Influenced by these subversive ideas, Misson and Caraccioli eventually found themselves aboard the French warship Victoire. When the captain was killed in a battle against an English vessel, Misson took command. Rather than returning to the rigidity of the French Navy, he proposed a new path to the crew. He spoke to them of a life where they would no longer be subjects to a king, but citizens of their own floating republic. The crew, swept up in the rhetoric of freedom, swore an oath to him. They wouldn't be pirates in the traditional sense, preying on poorly guarded merchant vessels to enrich themselves. Instead, they would be vigilantes of the sea, attacking only those who oppressed others, liberating cargo to survive, and freeing captive Africans destined for the New World. They christened their new society with a name derived from the Latin word for free, setting a course for the Indian Ocean to find a place where their ideals could take root. The colony they allegedly founded, Libertalia, was situated on the northeast coast of Madagascar, likely near Antongil Bay. It was described as a fortress of solitude and strength, protected by two large forts bristling with 40 cannons each, all of which had been liberated from European vessels. Inside this perimeter, the social rules were constructed to be the antithesis of the outside world. In an era defined by rigid class structures and the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, Libertalia was an anomaly. Wealth and resources were shared in common, a radical practice designed to ensure that no single member grew rich at the expense of another. There was no private property in the traditional sense, and the spoils of their voyages belonged to the community as a whole. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Libertalia legend was its stance on slavery. In the 17th and 18th centuries, pirate ships were often just as complicit in this trade as merchant vessels. However, Misson's pirates reportedly viewed slavery as the ultimate sin. Whenever they captured a ship, they freed the captives, offered them clothing and food, and invited them to join the colony as full equal citizens. The population of Libertalia became a melting pot of French, English, Dutch, and African peoples, all living under a democratic government. They held councils to make decisions, elected their leaders, and devised their own laws. To unify this diverse group, they even created a new, constructed language, a blend of their various native tongues, symbolizing their complete break from their former nations. Even their white flag was a rejection of the black flag of piracy. This merry band of sea brigands were early modern-day Robin Hoods of the high seas. The legend tells us that for some years, this outlaw community thrived. They farmed the land, built substantial dwellings, and continued their patrols of the Indian Ocean. Their numbers grew, bolstered by new recruits and the integration of the local Malagasy population. However, like all utopias in literature, Libertalia was destined for a tragic end. The narrative concludes with a sudden, devastating surprise attack by native Malagasy warriors who felt threatened by the colony's growing power and sway. The locals were defecting to the pirate republic in such numbers that the social order in their lands was under extreme threat. According to the narrative, this attack was swift and brutal, with most of the pirates being slain. All their defenses and fortifications had been built to fend off attacks from Europeans rather than the native Malagasy people. In the chaos, the settlement was overrun. Captain Misson and a handful of survivors managed to escape to their ships, but their paradise was burned to the ground. The story ends on a final note of melancholy when Misson's ship is lost in a violent storm, taking the founder of Libertalia and his dreams of a better world to the bottom of the ocean. Now you may wonder, given that last bit, how we know all these details, and I think that's a perfect segue into the analysis of the historicity of this pirate utopia. When we step away from the romance of the story and examine the historical record, the mirage of Libertalia begins to fade. The primary and arguably only source for the existence of this colony is a general history of the pirates, published in 1724. The book was credited to a Captain Charles Johnson, a mysterious figure who has never been identified. Some modern scholars and literary sleuths believe that Captain Johnson was actually a pseudonym for the famous writer Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. The book is a blend of accurate historical reporting and sensational fiction. While Johnson provided verifiable details about real pirates like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, his chapters on Captain Misson and Libertalia appear to be entirely fabricated. There are no ship's logs, no official admiralty reports, and no letters from the era that mention a Captain Misson or a settlement called Libertalia. This is a time when European navies were meticulously documenting the threats to their trade routes. A pirate-fortified colony with heavy artillery and a fleet of ships would have generated a mountain of paperwork in multiple countries. The silence from the archives is deafening. Historians overwhelmingly conclude that Libertalia was a literary invention. It's a political allegory created to critique the social injustices of 18th century Europe. By presenting a fictional society that functioned well without class hierarchies, the author was holding a mirror up to his own society's failures. It was most likely a philosophical thought experiment disguised as history, and designed to sell books to a public hungry for tales of the high seas. It may have also served as an abolitionist work, given the pirates' radical commitment to equality and liberating captives from ships. Interestingly, while the specific colony of Libertalia was almost certainly a myth, it was likely inspired by the very real pirate activities on Madagascar during that period. The island was indeed a haven for mariners who had gone rogue. It's well documented that pirates established outposts and small settlements along the coast. These weren't the egalitarian utopias of Misson's vision, but they were places where the strict hierarchies of Europe were discarded. There were instances of pirates marrying Malagasy women and raising families, creating unique blended societies. In the early 18th century, a man named Ratsimilaho, the son of an English pirate and a local princess, managed to unite various tribes into a powerful confederation. While this wasn't a democratic pirate republic, it was a legitimate political entity, born from the fusion of European pirates and indigenous cultures. Ultimately, all evidence points to Libertalia being a fabrication, a high-engagement story sandwiched between real biographies in a 1724 bestseller. Despite this place almost certainly being fictional, 3 centuries later, the legend of Libertalia still attracts attention from both scholars and the public alike. Picture a political crisis so profound, so desperate, that a powerful nobleman, dead and buried for nearly 3 decades, could simply walk back into existence. Not only that, he was welcomed back as a legitimate ruler, despite how absolutely absurd this appears to be on its face. It sounds like something pulled straight from Game of Thrones, but in the brutal political landscape of the mid-14th century Holy Roman Empire, this event actually happened. The man at the center of this historical audacity was known simply as the false Valdemar, and while you may not know his name, his actions would, indirectly, completely reshape the world. The individual at the heart of the original story was Valdemar the Great, a revered member of the House of Ascania. His death in 1319, followed shortly by the death of his minor cousin, marked the abrupt end of the ruling dynasty that had established the Margraviate. When the false Valdemar emerged in 1348, 30 years later, he wasn't merely impersonating a dead man. The King of Germany and Bohemia, the future emperor himself, accepted him as the legitimate ruler of Brandenburg for an absolutely chaotic 2-year period. To understand how a man could seize a major principality, we must first understand the vacuum left by the legitimate ruler. Valdemar the Great died on August 14th, 1319. The Margraviate of Brandenburg, a principality and future core of Prussia and Germany, was plunged into a succession crisis. But the stakes were much higher than usual, because the ruler of Brandenburg was one of just 7 people empowered to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor. When Valdemar's cousin, Henry II, died the following year, the ancient Ascanian line in Brandenburg truly became extinct. This termination of the native ruling house created the perfect conditions for a transfer of power, but it also sowed the seeds of massive future instability. In 1323, the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV of the House of Wittelsbach saw his opportunity. He awarded the March of Brandenburg to his own son, Ludwig the Elder. This move was immediately controversial because Brandenburg was one of 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire. The imposition of Wittelsbach rule was profoundly unpopular among the local nobility and citizens, who saw the new rulers as foreign, and they had good reason for this. The previous dynasty had cared deeply about developing Brandenburg, which was a backwater on the frontier of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. The Wittelsbachs had little interest in governing the territory effectively, or developing it in any meaningful sense. To them, this was an underdeveloped land that could be exploited to fund life in the Bavarian heartland, as well as political ambitions throughout the empire. The deep resentment against the foreign occupiers ensured that the moment a symbol of the lost native dynasty appeared, he would attract immediate, widespread support. The people didn't want rule by Bavarians. They wanted the caring rule of the Ascanians back. The appearance of the false Valdemar wasn't an isolated incident of fraud, but a calculated move in the highest stakes game in Europe, the struggle for control of the Holy Roman Empire. The 1340s were dominated by the bitter conflict between the reigning emperor, Louis IV Wittelsbach, and the newly elected rival, Charles IV of the House of Luxembourg. Charles IV, elected King of the Romans in 1346, needed every possible advantage to destabilize his imperial rival. Also, just adding this in during editing, this title, King of the Romans, was the title used for the Kingdom of Germany. Kind of odd, since the Holy Roman Emperor was also the King of Italy, which de jure included Rome, but that's beyond the scope of this video. When Louis IV died in 1347, the conflict didn't cease. Wittelsbach followers immediately elected anti-kings to oppose Charles as the German king. Charles IV sought to consolidate his position by gaining support in the north and diplomatically winning over former enemies. When news arrived in 1348 that a man claiming to be the former Margrave Valdemar had surfaced, Charles IV recognized the immense strategic value of this claim. The pretender was a potential political weapon against the Wittelsbach hold on Brandenburg, which was one of two prince electorates held by the Wittelsbach family. Instead of attacking the Wittelsbachs in Brandenburg, Charles could simply validate the impostor. By granting the false Valdemar official recognition and investment, Charles simultaneously delegitimized the Wittelsbach claim to the electorate and acquired a puppet ruler. After all, if the real Valdemar was still alive, the controversial acquisition of Brandenburg by the Wittelsbachs was null and void. This Valdemar would, so the thought went, be very inclined to vote for Charles as Holy Roman Emperor, and also denied a potential vote to a Wittelsbach candidate. This strategic validation transformed the impostor from a con man into a major player on the imperial chessboard. Charles, seizing the offensive, invested the man claiming to be Valdemar with the Margraviate of Brandenburg on October 2nd, 1348. He did so through his legal authority as the King of Germany, which was implicitly backed by the might of his powerful Czech lands. The narrative employed by the impostor was crucial to his success. Appearing in the Archbishopric of Magdeburg in the summer of 1348, he claimed that the burial conducted in 1319 was a deceit. The real Valdemar was only 39 years old at the time of his death, and somewhat unusually for the time, no one recorded how it happened. This provided a plausible basis for the false burial story. False Valdemar claimed he had spent the intervening time undertaking a pious pilgrimage to the Holy Land. During that time, he said he was living a simple Christ-like existence. This story was compelling for several reasons. First, a pilgrimage explained the long absence and the lack of communication. It also provided a morally acceptable reason for why the beloved Margrave had been gone, while the unpopular Bavarians messed everything up. After all, this is a medieval society where even the least spiritual person would, in essence, appear to be a religious fanatic to our modern eyes. Criticizing someone for listening to God's call to the Holy Land simply wasn't in the cards in polite society. The impostor quickly found adherents, particularly among those who opposed the Wittelsbach dynasty. While his true identity remains unknown, rumors circulated suggesting he might have been a commoner named Jacob Roebuck. Another possibility suggested he had once been in the real Valdemar's employ, allowing him to learn and mimic the Margrave's mannerisms and life details. What's important is that the actual man behind the mask was secondary to the political utility of the identity he assumed. The narrative of the returning native Ascanian prince, ready to oppose the foreign administration, was instantly compelling. Proof of identity in the Middle Ages was often reliant on oaths and recognized features, and the research suggests that physical identification techniques were rudimentary. The narrative provided enough social and political plausibility to satisfy the local populace, and, crucially, the Archbishop of Magdeburg, who had known the original Valdemar. By validating the pretender, the Archbishop and subsequently Charles IV, enabled the fraud to assume a physical manifestation of the Ascanian princely house. With imperial backing secured in October 1348, the false Valdemar became the effective ruler of Brandenburg. His 2-year tenure was a period of genuine chaos when imperial politics spilled over into violence in Brandenburg. The impostor commanded significant support, convincing a large segment of the March's population that he was the rightful Ascanian heir. This widespread allegiance forced the legitimate Wittelsbach rulers onto the defensive. Towns and cities were forced to choose which side they were allied to, and the effect of this is still seen today. The town of Brietzen, now in modern Germany, was renamed Treuenbrietzen, or True Brietzen, for staying loyal to the Wittelsbach faction. The political utility of the false Valdemar came to an abrupt end in April 1350, when he was no longer needed. However, this wasn't the result of a sudden investigative breakthrough. Rather, it was a purely diplomatic consequence. Charles IV, having successfully fractured the Wittelsbach position, no longer needed the impostor, and the man of dubious origin was now a major liability. By 1350, Charles had managed to win over key factions in the empire, and was ready to negotiate a broader settlement with the Wittelsbachs. This would stabilize the imperial government under his own growing authority. The resolution came in the form of the Treaty of Eltville in 1349, after Charles defeated a Wittelsbach-backed anti-king in battle. As part of this comprehensive agreement with the Wittelsbach dynasty, Charles IV formally deposed the false Valdemar. This sudden unmasking proves that the impostor's legitimacy had been entirely dependent on the emperor's political will. As part of the agreement, the Wittelsbachs were given back the electorate of Brandenburg, and everyone agreed to forget the whole Valdemar episode ever happened. But there's a really weird postscript to the life of false Valdemar, which has made some question the whole situation even further. Upon his official exposure in 1350, the false Valdemar didn't face the execution or imprisonment that one might expect for a man who had briefly claimed a royal electoral title. Instead, he fled to the court of the princes of Anhalt-Dessau. The princes of Anhalt were kinsmen of the extinct Brandenburg House of Ascania. They welcomed the exposed impostor, allowing him to live out his days under their protection until his death from old age in 1356. Notably, some have found it highly curious that the family he was impersonating took him in as their own. This has led some to speculate there may have been a deeper plot involving the House of Ascania, attempting to regain the throne of Brandenburg. That said, this is just pure speculation, and there's no direct evidence to verify that this was the case. And notably, in a really weird twist, the House of Ascania is, at the present day, known for adult adoptions of rich people who want to use the title Prince of Anhalt. Most famously, in 1980, a man named Hans Lichtenberg was adopted by Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt. He parlayed this bizarre adult adoption process into a marriage with the actress Zsa Zsa Gabor, but I digress. The story of the false Valdemar offers a powerful lens through which to view the structural weaknesses of the Holy Roman Empire in the mid-14th century. Historical consensus holds that the true identity of the man remains unknown, and attempts to definitively link him to any specific identity have been unsuccessful. His real identity is ultimately irrelevant, as his historical importance lies entirely in his function as a political tool. The crisis was generated not by the man himself, but by the profound systemic instability. This is the instability that allowed Charles, then an imperial claimant, to manufacture legitimacy out of thin air to decimate a rival dynasty. The fact that Brandenburg, a crucial electorate, could be successfully destabilized in such a way says quite a bit about the nature of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Notably, The repercussions of the false Valdemar's brief appearance were profound and long-lasting. By undermining the Wittelsbachs, Charles IV ensured the eventual transition of Brandenburg to the Luxembourg dynasty in 1373. Brandenburg eventually passed to the House of Hohenzollern in 1415, laying the foundation for modern Prussia, which in turn unified Germany in 1871. It's no stretch to say that if false Valdemar hadn't woken up one day in 1348 and decided to impersonate a long-dead ruler, we'd be living in an entirely different world. A legend recounts that a woman once asked the Count Saint-Germain's butler if it was true the Count had already lived during the time of Christ. The butler replied dryly that he wouldn't know, as he'd only been in the Count's service for 300 years. This anecdote, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the paradox of the Count of Saint-Germain. For nearly half a century, he charmed, advised, and startled the courts of Europe. He maintained an image so fantastical that Voltaire dubbed him a man who knows everything. Saint-Germain was and remains a complete mystery, serving simultaneously as a celebrated 18th century polymath and, in modern times, an immortal spiritual guide. But a closer look at the Count suggests that he was, more likely, an agent of an unknown government, trading his reputation for intelligence. Saint-Germain made his entrance onto the international scene in the mid-17th century, but his origins are mired in a fog of deliberate contradiction. He used a variety of names and titles throughout his life, an accepted practice among traveling aristocrats, but one that Saint-Germain employed to an extreme degree. This intentional obscurity allowed him to deflect inquiries and invent fantasies about his past, such as the famous claim of being 500 years old. Historical investigations suggest several possibilities for his birth. One plausible theory places his birth around 1710 in San Germano, Savoy, perhaps as the son of an Italian princess, with a local tax collector as his supposed father. He sometimes claimed to be the son of Prince Francis II Rákóczi of Transylvania. Adding to the chronological confusion, when he arrived in Schleswig in 1779, he told his then patron, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, that he was 88 years old. If this was true, this would push his potential birth year back to 1691. But as with everything with the Count, nothing was certain. The sheer volume of conflicting identities suggests that the Count's obscurity was not merely happenstance, but a vital tool. Many of his contemporaries suggested that his lack of a fixed identity may have been a clue that he was actually an agent of an unknown government. By being simultaneously everyone and no one, his persona provided him with the necessary camouflage to move seamlessly between Europe's royal courts. The Count's influence derived not just from his mysterious background, but from verifiable, multidisciplinary genius. He was a polyglot, fluent in all major European languages, and a verified expert in art, philosophy, history, and science. He was also a celebrated musician, known as a virtuoso on both the piano and violin. Several of his compositions were published and performed in London and Paris, and are still available today, though none are widely performed. However, the most intriguing aspect of his reputation was his connection to the mystical science of alchemy. Saint-Germain claimed to possess knowledge of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, the secrets that would grant wealth and immortality. Unlike common charlatans, he had the ability to demonstrate practical material results that convinced influential patrons. A notable anecdote involves King Louis XV, who presented Saint-Germain with a deeply flawed diamond. The Count took the stone, and upon returning it a month later, it was found to be flawless. After having it weighed and appraised, the king's jeweler valued the improved stone to be far more valuable. This tale, which appears to be true, relies on the assumption that the diamond that was returned was indeed the same gem at all. This so-called ability to transform and improve materials was crucial to his career. His demonstrable skill, whether based on genuinely advanced chemical knowledge or sophisticated trickery, provided him with unparalleled access to the European elite. His success in creating valuable materials, like the improved diamond or his development of rich dyes, validated his position in court in a way mere philosophy could never have achieved. This served as a powerful shield, protecting his potentially true operational work, diplomacy, and intelligence gathering under the guise of an eccentric scientist and artist. The Count's unique position, blending incredible talents with total anonymity, made him invaluable to high-stakes statecraft. Louis XV trusted Saint-Germain implicitly, often using him for sensitive diplomatic tasks. During the height of the 7 Years' War, Saint-Germain was instrumental in secret negotiations. Around 1760, he traveled to the Dutch Republic, attempting to mediate peace talks between Britain and France. These activities were so clandestine that they immediately led to accusations of espionage, suggesting he was working for foreign powers, perhaps the Russians. Though never formally charged, these allegations underscored his role as a necessary, untraceable agent used for sensitive information transfer and back-channel operations. His connection to Russia is particularly suggestive of his influence. Saint-Germain was allegedly present in St. Petersburg and credited by some with assisting the coup in 1762 that led to the overthrow of Tsar Peter III and the ascension of Catherine the Great. Despite a life spent advising kings and claiming access to untold wealth and eternal existence, Saint-Germain's historical narrative culminates in a surprisingly mundane death. He spent his final years under the protection of his admirer, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, in Schleswig in modern Germany. He died on February 27, 1784, and was subsequently buried in a grave in a small church in a tiny town in Schleswig. However, the official record of his death only served as the historical inflection point for the legend of his immortality. When no relatives appeared to claim his belongings, the city auctioned off his possessions, as was the style at the time. The inventory was dramatically anticlimactic. His estate contained only modest personal effects, clothing, and a small sum of money. While most accepted this meant that he was a spy who had spent all his money or a charlatan who never had what he claimed, another story soon emerged. A modest end for a man who boasted of immortal secrets perfectly primed the public imagination for the story of his survival. Almost immediately, reports of his continued existence circulated through Europe. A French countess claimed to have met and conversed at length with Saint-Germain after the storming of the Bastille in 1789. She stated that he accurately predicted France's immediate and terrifying future. She continued to report sightings of him on significant historical dates, including in 1820, noting that he always appeared to be no older than late middle age. As the 19th century went on, these purported sightings tapered off, and for a time this mysterious count became a historical mystery and little more. But then things got really weird. In the 20th century, New Age movements began to latch on to the Count as a figure of great spiritual power. In these new esoteric doctrines, the Count was redefined as the ascended master Saint-Germain, a great spiritual teacher who transcended mortality through alchemy. Present-day adherents believe he currently operates from a higher dimension, guiding and guarding humanity. Under this belief, he sits on a council with such venerated figures like Jesus Christ, Confucius, Gautama Buddha, and a whole bunch of others. The Count of Saint-Germain mastered the art of being a contradiction. He was the man who advised kings and composed beautiful music, but would also allude to the fact that he was 500 years old. He was the wealthy and successful diplomat whose life was filled with intrigue, but died with nothing but modest possessions. Even today, he continues to exist in parallel and contradictory realities. He's the frustratingly opaque real historical figure whose life, likely as a spy in the service of an unknown power, intersected with many of the crucial decades of the Enlightenment. But he's also a New Age spiritual icon to a fairly significant group of people who hold that he's currently guiding humanity alongside Jesus Christ. According to legend, there was a single morning when the collected knowledge of humanity was suddenly rendered into ash with the burning of a library. I'm not talking about some obscure regional archive, but a universal repository aiming to hold all the written knowledge of the ancient Western world. If you're at all familiar with the ancient world, you've likely already guessed that I'm talking about the Great Library of Alexandria. But this isn't the story of the myths surrounding the burning of the library, but rather a look into the nature of the knowledge that was held and produced while it stood. To understand the scope of the library, you have to appreciate the scale of the city that housed it. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, was engineered to be a massive cosmopolitan hub linking Greece and Egypt. Featuring wide boulevards laid out in a grid and grand structures of granite and marble, the city was intended as a global showplace. When Alexander's general Ptolemy I established the new dynasty, his ambition was unprecedented. He aimed to make Alexandria the undeniable economic and intellectual capital of the entire known world. While it's unclear when the Great Library was first established, it's generally believed that it first came together under Ptolemy's immediate successor. The Great Library wasn't just a storage facility as the name would suggest to our modern eyes. It was an integral part of the larger Museion, a research institution dedicated to the Muses. Also, just as a quick aside, I had never put two and two together that our modern word museum was derived from the Muses. But now looking at the word, I find it hard to believe that I never made this connection at any point in my life. But I digress. The Museion served as a state-funded university or think tank where scholars received royal stipends, lived together, and collaborated intensely. This centralized, lavishly funded royal patronage transformed Alexandria into the capital of knowledge and learning, distinguishing it from rivals like the Library of Pergamum. The Ptolemies intended the Museion and its library to bring together the very best scholars of the Hellenistic world and, crucially, to produce new scholarship. This state sponsorship yielded revolutionary works. Under the Ptolemies, hundreds of key figures worked within this structure over the centuries. Zenodotus of Ephesus, for instance, undertook the essential work of standardizing the texts of Homer, establishing definitive versions of the great epics. Callimachus, a poet, created the Pinakies, a comprehensive book catalog often credited as the world's first systematic library index. There was also Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a brilliant polymath and chief librarian who wasn't content just to read about the world. He successfully calculated the circumference of the Earth to a remarkable degree of accuracy using mathematical and geographical principles developed at the Museion. The great inventor and engineer Hero of Alexandria, who invented the world's first steam engine, was also associated with the Great Library. That's one thing we modern people often forget. This library wasn't solely about preserving the past. It was about building the future using the library's massive resource base. These scholars weren't just preserving the past, they were aggressively building the future, driven by the library's massive resource base. The Ptolemies pursued a policy of universal acquisition, unprecedented in its scope and scale. Their goal, at least aspirationally, was to acquire a copy of every written work ever produced in the entire known world. The Ptolemies' policies for procuring texts were famously aggressive and well-funded. One controversial practice was the seizing of any written documents found on ships entering Alexandria's harbor to have them copied. In an act that can only be called state-sponsored theft, they kept the originals and returned the copies to the owners. Given the amount of time it took to produce a single copied text at the time, this effectively meant that many of these copies were simply never claimed and also entered into the library. We can't know precisely how many scrolls were held in the collection. Ancient sources offer conflicting and often hyperbolic figures, reflecting the mythological status of the library. Estimates for the total collection size at its height vary wildly, from a conservative 40,000 scrolls up to 400,000. Some ancient sources even report figures as high as 1 million scrolls and books, though this is generally believed to be a literary device rather than an actual estimate. In essence, saying that there were 1 million books there was basically just saying there's a near infinite amount of content in the library. Modern historians often look skeptically at numbers in the 6 figures, calculating that such numbers would only be possible if the library contained numerous identical copies. However, others have proposed that numbers in the 6 figures could be accurate, but that we could simply be unaware of approximately 90% of ancient Greek writers. Personally, I like this theory, as we know of a lot of ancient writers, simply because other authors cited their works in surviving ancient texts. I think it's safe to assume that most ancient works didn't make a splash and were never widely cited, or perhaps never cited at all. Also, it's important to remember that many of these works were short scrolls rather than full-on books. When ancient writers made their estimations, they included all documents held in the library, not just full-blown books. If my intuition on this is correct, I see no reason why the library couldn't have had over 100,000 works, especially given the Ptolemaic patronage of the project. The intellectual breadth was truly cosmopolitan, and there were some non-Greek works included as well. However, it's important to remember that the entire known world at that time was, in essence, Hellenized at the elite level that produced scholars. A scholar from Egypt would be writing in Greek, just as a scholar from Persia would be as well. Hellenic culture reigned supreme. However, it became a critical cross-cultural center, facilitating immense translation projects. The most famous example is the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Pentateuch into Greek. This monumental translation was undertaken in Alexandria out of practical necessity for the large Hellenized Jewish community. Many having only a limited understanding of the biblical language, they wanted to be able to read key religious texts in a language they could fully understand. This was made possible specifically because of the abundance of research material available at the library, as well as the scholars that resided there. The library wasn't just collecting, it was actively integrating and translating world knowledge, confirming its unique status as an incubator of global scholarship. To truly grasp the magnitude of the eventual loss, it's important to consider the staggering economics of ancient knowledge production and reproduction. Most items were made of papyrus, which could only be produced from a reed that grew in the Nile. Papyrus was fragile, cumbersome, and expensive. Beyond the cost of the material lay the price of skilled labor. Copying texts was a pre-industrial, non-mechanized process that demanded expert scribes. Transcribing a major philosophical or historical work wasn't a matter of hours, but often required weeks or even months of dedicated, specialized labor for a single copy. Therefore, when a scroll was destroyed, it represented an immense, irreplaceable expenditure of both controlled raw materials and highly trained human capital. A library of even 40,000 scrolls, the lowest estimate of all, represented millions of man-hours in transcription time alone, let alone the hours that went into producing the research. The centralization of this accumulated wealth, while crucial for scholarship, proved to be its greatest vulnerability. Because widespread mass distribution was impossible, a single master copy held in Alexandria often represented the most authoritative or even the sole surviving record of a work. If a text lacked copies elsewhere, its destruction meant total intellectual annihilation. Notably, the fall of the Library of Alexandria in a single day due to a fire is more legend than history, though like many myths, there's a significant kernel of truth. In reality, the library was dealt numerous blows, starting with Julius Caesar inadvertently burning some of the warehouses on the library's grounds in a siege in 48 BC. When the Romans fully took over Egypt a couple decades later, the royal patronage of the Ptolemies naturally came to an end. Without meaningful funding, the library and the Museion began their slow slide into obscurity, having never really recovered from the Julius Caesar blaze. The main library and the Museion were eventually disestablished sometime in the 3rd century, though the ultimate reason why is unknown. A fragment of the institution called the Daughter Library continued on until 391, when Emperor Theodosius banned it, considering it a pagan institution. The destruction of this institution marked the end of the last institutional vestige of the Great Library of Alexandria. Also, before I close this segment out, I do have to mention that Hypatia of Alexandria wasn't associated with the library, and it no longer existed while she was active. The story about how her real life became linked to the legend of the fall of the library is fascinating, and I'll be covering that in a future video, so make sure to subscribe for more content. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just jumping in the middle to ask for a small favor. If you're enjoying this video, click the share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members. Sharing my work with people who love historical content keeps my channel growing and allows me to keep cooking up new content. If you were asked to name the most outrageously free spirit in ancient history, you'd probably choose Diogenes of Sinope. As the quintessential cynic, he was the ancient world's greatest anti-conventionalist, a philosopher who didn't just advocate for a simple life, he lived it. And keep in mind that the word cynic is derived from a Greek word meaning dog-like, because trust me, this is going to come up in this segment. He famously slept in a public earthenware barrel and deliberately shocked the sensibilities of Athenian society with his activities. To give one of the better-known examples, and I've got to be a bit careful about how I say this, he was known to summon the Cyclops in the Agora, if you get my drift. Yeah, you heard me. Diogenes polished the spear of Achilles in the public square, in plain sight of everyone. And just to be clear, in case you were wondering, this was most certainly not the style at the time. His life was a philosophical performance dedicated entirely to radical self-sufficiency, known in Greek as autarkeia. He famously told Alexander the Great, who offered him anything he desired, to simply move out of his sunlight. This man, who dedicated his existence to challenging pretense and exposing falsehoods, demanded control over every facet of his being. Given his dedication to dramatic, purposeful living, it follows that his final moments couldn't possibly have been ordinary. To understand the legend surrounding Diogenes' death, we first have to appreciate his radical commitment to life in line with nature. Born in Sinope in Asia Minor, he was forced into exile, likely arriving in Athens already committed to rigorous ascetic training. He likely died around 320 BC, reaching the advanced age of nearly 90, probably while living in Corinth at a gymnasium called the Craneum. Diogenes' philosophical mission was derived from his bizarre interpretation of the Delphic oracle's equally cryptic and bizarre statement that he should deface coinage. He took this mandate as his lifelong task: to destroy the accepted norms and conventions that govern society, and to call humanity back to an inherently natural state. He didn't bother writing comprehensive philosophical systems. Instead, he conveyed cynicism through personal, often provocative actions, positioning himself as a vigilant watchdog of morality who broke all the rules. For Diogenes, a life guided by reason was a life guided by nature, meaning true happiness and independence were only possible outside the bounds of the structured community. This required complete disregard for luxury and social customs. He maintained that autarkia was the ultimate goal, allowing a person to oppose courage to fortune and nature to convention. Diogenes structured his entire existence around the philosophical principle of self-mastery. Because of this, his biographers felt a strong ideological requirement to ensure his death reflected this absolute control. Whether this control was viewed as a positive or a negative would determine what sort of end-of-life treatment Diogenes got in a specific biography. A quiet, passive demise would have unintentionally undermined his lifelong philosophical assertion that he was the absolute captain of his own destiny. The multiple versions of Diogenes' death derive mainly from biographies which were compiled in a single text centuries after his death. Modern scholars caution that these ancient biographies are notoriously unreliable, often incorporating anecdotal material to enhance the value of the story. This was doubly true for death, and biographers of the time didn't simply record facts. They viewed the death scene as the final literary chance to confirm and glorify a character, a practice known as exitus illustrium uirorum. This essentially provided stylized deaths that were quote-unquote in character for a historical figure, rather than just saying, "Oh, he fell and broke his hip and died 2 days later." One of the most powerful and philosophically resonant accounts claims Diogenes chose the precise moment of his departure, dying by willfully holding his breath until he suffocated. This narrative, recorded by Cercidas of Megalopolis, presents the Cynic ideal in its most dramatic form. To master the most fundamental biological function, the impulse to breathe, is to achieve absolute freedom from the physical body and from nature itself. This act confirms the triumph of Diogenes' rational will over physical necessity, positioning his death as a final exercise in self-sufficiency. Modern science has proven this to be impossible, at least strictly speaking. While you can hold your breath until you pass out, once you've passed out, your body will begin to breathe again automatically, as if you're sleeping. That said, I suppose it's always possible that he held his breath and then fell and smashed his head in. Another vivid, if strange, version suggests Diogenes was taken by illness, specifically severe colic, after consuming a raw octopus. This tale serves as a dramatic commentary on the limits of his devotion to flouting social norms. By choosing to eat raw, unprepared food, Diogenes rejected one of humanity's most fundamental civilized conventions, the preparation of meals. His death, in this context, becomes an almost cautionary illustration that nature itself is indifferent, unforgiving, and that there's a reason for conventions. This biographical ending would have been understood by ancients to be a refutation of Diogenes as a person. A third account suggests that Diogenes died not from the seafood itself, but from a severe bite sustained in a struggle with stray dogs, potentially over the raw octopus. This narrative is rich in dark irony, creating a striking symmetry for ancient audiences. The man who willingly took the insult of being called kynikos, meaning dog-like in Greek, and lived among stray animals, is killed by his own symbolic kin. This unexpected reversal provided biographers with a shocking, memorable conclusion to his story. Diogenes was dog-like and was killed by dogs while doing a dog-like activity. For a biographer who wanted to write a memorable ending to Diogenes' life, it was low-hanging fruit. Despite the enduring appeal of these dramatic scenarios, contemporary scholarly opinion overwhelmingly holds that these tales are all fiction. Based on the available evidence, which notes his remarkably advanced age, the most plausible historical conclusion is that Diogenes died naturally. In ancient Greece, hitting 70 was considered a respectable but attainable age, while hitting 80 was quite uncommon but nothing to write home about. Hitting 90, though, was incredibly rare, and if you made it that far, you were basically on borrowed time. In the end, we're never going to know with certainty how Diogenes died, but it's pretty remarkable that he made it to 90 given his unconventional lifestyle. In the early 2nd century AD, the city of Rome was a sprawling metropolis, and likely the largest city in the world at the time. Historians estimate over 1 million people lived in Rome by the 2nd century. Of these, a significant fraction were enslaved people, perhaps on the order of 1/3 of the population. The remainder were free residents, which in Rome during this time mostly meant Roman citizens. Thus, hundreds of thousands of citizens called Rome home in 100 AD. The question is, how many of those citizens were actually working for a living? To modern eyes, we might assume most able-bodied urban dwellers would be employed. However, ancient Rome's economy and society were very different from ours. A large class of the population, the enslaved laborers previously mentioned, performed the bulk of manual work, and even many skilled jobs. Meanwhile, many free citizens survived without steady jobs, supported by slave labor, public welfare, and the vast wealth of the empire. The result was that a surprisingly large percentage of Roman citizens did not work in the sense of holding a regular occupation. Contemporary writers and modern historians alike have noted that Rome became a city of parasitic consumers living off the spoils of empire. To analyze this, we need to look at who among Rome's citizens did work, what jobs were available, and how others managed to get by without work. One major reason for low employment among Roman citizens was the institution of slavery. Enslaved people in Rome held jobs across the board. They weren't only domestic servants or gladiators or laborers, they also served as teachers, scribes, physicians, artisans, and more. Further, virtually any menial labor or basic service could be done by a slave. Wealthy households had slaves for cooking, cleaning, and tutoring children. Even many professions that would be well paid today, like teachers and doctors, were often occupied by highly educated Greek slaves in Roman times. This meant fewer openings for free citizens to find work. In addition, a large segment of working Romans were freedmen, former slaves who had been freed by their masters and who became citizens upon gaining freedom. Freedmen often remained in the city and put their skills to use in trades and businesses. In fact, evidence from tomb inscriptions indicates that the working economy of Rome was dominated by people of servile origin. Over 60% of inscriptions that mention an occupation in the city were commissioned by freedmen or even slaves, proudly recording their trades and achievements. These freedmen worked as bakers, carpenters, fishmongers, shopkeepers, leather workers. Basically, they formed the backbone of Rome's artisan and retail class. Further, even though they were now technically free, they still had obligations towards their former owners, who were then called their patrons. A poor freeborn citizen would find himself competing with skilled ex-slaves for jobs in every craft and service sector. For the lowest class free citizens, opportunities to earn a wage were limited. Some picked up work as casual laborers. For example, hauling goods at the docks or construction sites when large building projects were underway. Many lingered each day in hopes of being hired for short-term tasks. These day laborers lived a very precarious existence. Ancient sources and modern analyses describe a large class of underemployed poor in Rome, people with no steady income who survived on odd jobs and state charity. Even those who had a trade often earned very little as they had to compete against highly skilled laborers who were doing it for free. If so many Roman citizens had trouble finding gainful work, how did they survive? The Roman answer was the famous policy of bread and circuses. The emperors provided a grain dole, a form of public welfare, to feed the city's population, coupled with plentiful entertainment to keep people happy. By around 100 AD, about 200,000 adult male citizens in Rome were receiving free grain every month. This state-sponsored grain distribution essentially fed the poor of the capital. To put that number in perspective, 200,000 men would represent roughly 20% of Rome's total inhabitants in this period. Given that those 200,000 were generally heads of households, the grain dole supported a much larger portion of the citizen population, including their wives and children. Notably, the vast majority of citizen families needed the dole to survive. The bread was accompanied by the circuses, so to speak, and the entertainment was plentiful and free. The emperors and magistrates put on hundreds of holidays and festivals throughout the year, staging gladiator games, chariot races, theatrical shows, and more. During Emperor Claudius's reign from 41 to 54 AD, there were well over 150 days per year, classified as official holidays, when no public business was conducted. Rome's leaders were quite aware that keeping the urban populace fed and entertained was a key to maintaining order. Modern scholars interpret this as the Roman state essentially buying urban peace by subsidizing the citizens' livelihood. The grain dole and extravagant games pacified the unemployed masses, a sort of social contract where the people gave up political power in exchange for being taken care of. It was, arguably, history's first big welfare program, and it recognized that hundreds of thousands of Romans had no prospect of meaningful employment. By providing the essentials, the empire made it viable for so many citizens to remain idle, and to prevent discontent, they provided entertainment. It's important to note that even for those citizens who did have jobs, the workday was relatively short, and the tempo of work was relaxed by modern comparison. Most Romans who worked had a 6-hour workday, roughly from dawn until noon. After midday, business generally closed, and people spent the afternoons at leisure, attending baths, watching games, or resting. There was no concept of a busy 9-to-5 grind, and the culture of Rome valued leisure time. Of course, it's necessary to remember that this laid-back lifestyle was supported heavily by enslaved people performing most vital tasks in society. These slaves had horrible lives, and were often worked to death in the mines or on giant farming estates. Essentially, free Roman citizens could afford to work less because enslaved workers and provincial resources propped up their urban comforts. Taking all this into account, what percentage of Rome's citizens were actually working around 100 AD? While exact figures are impossible as the Romans didn't keep labor statistics, historians have made educated estimates. Modern economic studies describe mass unemployment and underemployment in Imperial Rome as a unique phenomenon. Scholars estimate that only between 20 and 30% of adult Roman male citizens worked in what we would describe as a regular employment capacity. Including those who worked irregularly or at their leisure, this number may have been as high as 40%. Notably, even lower-class women with Roman citizenship didn't work, unless it was to assist in a small family business. To put it simply, a huge percentage of Roman citizens in Rome didn't work for a living. As economic historians have noted, it wouldn't be until the 20th century that such large, totally unproductive adult male populations would be seen again. The renowned Apache warrior Geronimo spent his life fighting American and Mexican forces intent on capturing him and his people. In 1886, he surrendered for the final time and, deemed too dangerous to ever be released, spent the rest of his life in captivity. But the conflict that surrounded him in life didn't end with his death. Instead, it morphed into a macabre, century-long controversy. His remains are now allegedly in the possession of a powerful, ultra-secretive organization representing the final symbolic capture of a legendary figure by shadowy forces. Geronimo died of pneumonia in February 1909 and was buried at the Apache Indian Prisoner of War Cemetery on the base. His general gravesite today is marked by a distinctive pyramid of stones topped with an eagle. However, these stones don't mark the exact spot he was buried. Rather, this collection of stones marks the generalized area where he was initially buried in an unmarked grave. His burial on active military land meant his remains were under the direct jurisdiction of the institution that had held him captive. A decade after Geronimo's burial, the cemetery at Fort Sill became the site of an alleged grave robbery. Around 1917, a group of soldiers who were also members of the elite Yale University secret society, known as Skull and Bones, was stationed at the fort during World War I. Interestingly, among the men who were there was Prescott Bush, a future United States Senator and the father and grandfather of two American presidents. Known for stealing significant quote-unquote keepsakes, this group allegedly exhumed Geronimo's grave. The primary evidence is a letter written in 1918 by bonesman Winter Mead. This correspondence casually boasted that the skull of Geronimo, along with both of his femurs, had been looted by other bonesmen. He claimed in this letter that they had been removed from Fort Sill, and they were now inside the Society's New Haven headquarters, known as the Tomb. It's important to note that he didn't claim to be directly involved in this, or have directly seen any evidence of this. However, the skull's authenticity, if such a skull is even in their possession, is intensely disputed. Historians suggest the gravesite was still unmarked at the time, potentially leading the college-aged hooligans to rob another grave entirely. Some have also questioned whether Meade was ever at Fort Sill, and whether the letter was supposed to be read literally or not. There's also been allegations that the letter was effectively an internal hoax, perhaps as a way to quote-unquote prank new initiates to the secret society. Furthermore, some direct descendants on the Mescalero Apache Reservation believe that local Apaches relocated Geronimo's body soon after his death. This possibility greatly complicates any certainty about the identity of the remains held in the tomb, if these remains are even there. Notably, Skull and Bones has maintained a wall of silence, as one may expect from a secret society. Yale, for its part, has consistently denied involvement, stating it holds no relics or bones belonging to Geronimo, and claiming the secret society operates independently. In 2009, faced with the enduring controversy, Geronimo's lineal descendants filed a federal lawsuit against the federal government, Yale, and Skull and Bones. They aimed to compel the return of the alleged skull under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. The federal court ultimately dismissed the claims against all the defendants on technical legal grounds. The decision hinged on two legal barriers. First, the court ruled the act was inapplicable. The law establishes ownership priority only for items excavated or discovered after its enactment in November 1990. Since the alleged theft occurred well before this, the claim fell outside the statute's temporal scope. Second, the plaintiffs failed to overcome the doctrine of sovereign immunity with respect to the feds only. This principle shields the government from lawsuits unless that right is explicitly waived. At present, the true location of Geronimo's skull and his other remains continues to be an unsolved historical mystery. He may still be interred at Fort Sill in an unmarked grave, or he may have been secretly repatriated. However, if the allegations are true, his skull and some of his other earthly remains may still remain locked up in a sinister vault in New England. On a cold winter night in 1799, 22-year-old Elma Sands left her Manhattan boarding house with a secret. She planned to elope with Levy Weeks. She never returned. 11 days later, her lifeless body was pulled from the bottom of a well in Lower Manhattan, shocking the city and setting the stage for one of America's first sensational trials. The investigation and trial that followed would captivate the public, pit powerful lawyers against each other, and leave a mystery that still haunts New York history. Elma Sands lived in a Greenwich Street boarding house run by her cousins, Catherine and Elias Ring. On December 22, 1799, she confided that she and Levy Weeks, a fellow boarder who had been courting her, were going to marry in secret that night. Around 8 that night, she left home, presumably with Levy. By 10, Weeks had returned alone, expressing surprise that Elma was still out and denying that they had been together earlier. When Elma didn't come home, alarm spread quickly. New York was blanketed in snow that evening, and some witnesses claimed they saw Elma riding in a one-horse sleigh with 2 men. One reportedly resembled Weeks, and the horse matched one owned by Levy's brother Ezra. Suspicion fell on Weeks as the last person seen with her, but nothing came of it just yet. A few days later, boys discovered a woman's hat floating in the water of a well in Manhattan, in what's now the Soho area. It was recognized as Elma's, pointing investigators to the well. On January 2nd, 1800, searchers pulled Elma's body from the bottom of that well. Her corpse showed clear signs of foul play, and authorities started to investigate, with Weeks swiftly deemed the prime suspect. Even before Weeks was brought to trial, the city was outraged over Elma's fate. The Ring family immediately accused Levy in public, sharing details of her disappearance with the press. New York newspapers ran with the story, and soon the case was the talk of the town. In the court of public opinion, Weeks was considered guilty before he was even arrested. In a macabre twist, Elma's body was put on public display at the boarding house for several days before burial. So many people came to view the victim's body that the coffin had to be moved outside to accommodate the onlookers. This grim exhibition further stirred emotions. Seeing Elma's pale form made the tragedy real and intensified calls for justice. By the time Weeks was indicted, angry crowds were clamoring for his swift execution. Levy Weeks was a young carpenter who worked for his wealthy brother Ezra Weeks, one of New York's most prominent builders. Desperate to save Levy from a likely hanging, Ezra pulled in favors and used his connections to secure an extraordinary defense team. Notably, Ezra's company had built Alexander Hamilton's mansion, so to say he had some clout would be an understatement. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, usually bitter political rivals, agreed to join forces to defend Weeks. They enlisted a third attorney, Henry Brockholst Livingston, an experienced trial lawyer, and future Supreme Court justice. This dream team of counsel was unprecedented and turned the trial into a major public spectacle. The trial of Levy Weeks began on March 31, 1800 in New York City Hall before Chief Justice John Lansing, Jr. The case became so widely followed that crowds of onlookers from all levels of society packed the courtroom. The prosecution's case, led by Cadwallader Colden, was entirely circumstantial, with no eyewitnesses. Prosecutors argued that Weeks had seduced Elma with false promises of marriage and then eliminated her to escape the scandal, perhaps fearing she was carrying his child. Boarders from the Ring House testified about Levy and Elma's relationship and the events of the night she vanished. One witness claimed to see him lurking around the well at night shortly before the crime. Another witness, a fellow boarder, claimed that Levy was the type to get into intimate situations with young ladies and leave them high and dry. He claimed that Levy promised them marriage, but insisted he couldn't do this without banging harder than a carriage wheel hitting cobblestone. Hamilton, Burr, and Livingston vigorously countered these claims. The defense cast doubt on every aspect of the story. They argued there may not even have been a killing at all. To support this theory, they brought in medical witnesses who now asserted that Elma might have jumped into the well herself out of despair. Acquaintances described Elma as emotionally troubled before her death, even recalling that she had questioned the purpose of life. Further, they insinuated that she may have been having affairs with married men, including her cousin's husband. The trial was unusually long for its time, running into the early morning hours of the second day. As proceedings dragged past midnight, jurors struggled to stay awake. Justice Lansing refused to pause for rest and even denied the prosecutor a closing argument, signaling that he found the evidence against Weeks weak. In his charge to the jury, Lansing bluntly stated that the proof was insufficient to convict. It took the jury only about 5 minutes to deliberate before returning a verdict of not guilty. Levy Weeks was acquitted, ending the trial in astonishing fashion. The verdict did not calm the public's fury. Many New Yorkers were outraged that Weeks walked free, believing that a rich man's influence had helped him escape punishment. Judge Lansing's conduct was widely criticized as a betrayal of justice. In the aftermath, Weeks was shunned and harassed. Unable to live in New York amid the hostility, he left the city and eventually settled in Natchez, Mississippi, where he quietly rebuilt his life as an architect until his death in 1819. No one else was ever charged for Elma's death, which meant the case remained officially unsolved. Some key figures in the trial later met tragic ends. In 1804, Burr and Hamilton's simmering rivalry exploded in their famous duel. Years later, in 1829, Judge Lansing vanished without a trace, leading some to whisper about a curse tied to Elma Sands. While it looks to me that there wasn't sufficient evidence to find Levy Weeks guilty, there's no denying that the proceedings carried a troubling stench of influence and favoritism. The entire case rested on circumstantial fragments, yet the speed with which the judge dismissed the prosecution's arguments felt unusual even by early American standards. Lansing's refusal to allow a full closing argument and his insistence on pushing the jury through exhaustion are odd choices. However, his pointed remarks about the weakness of the evidence creates the impression that the outcome had been shaped long before the verdict was delivered. Add to that the towering presence of Hamilton and Burr, both political powerhouses with deep ties to Ezra Weeks, and the appearance of a slanted playing field becomes hard to ignore. Levy may have walked free because the evidence wasn't strong enough, but the way the trial unfolded left many convinced justice had been openly bent. You're traveling alone on a dark, winding road, with only the rhythmic clopping of your horse's hooves for company. Suddenly, you hear another set of hoofbeats behind you, gaining fast. You urge your horse onward, but the sound grows louder, closer, an unnatural thunder in the quiet night. You risk a glance over your shoulder and see a towering figure on a powerful steed, matching your pace with terrifying ease. He's cloaked in shadow, but as he draws alongside you, you see the truth, a sight that freezes the blood in your veins. Where the rider's head should be, there is only an empty, ragged collar. This chilling figure, the Headless Horseman, is more than just the villain of a single ghost story. He's an ancient archetype, a phantom who has galloped through the folklore of cultures across the world for over a millennium. Long before a galloping Hessian terrorized New York's Hudson Valley, his spectral ancestors haunted the roads and moors of Europe. The archetype is not a monolith, and each culture has shaped its horseman to reflect its deepest fears. Perhaps the most sinister of these is Ireland's Dullahan. His name means dark man in Gaelic, and he's a dark fairy from the underworld. The Dullahan rides a headless black horse and carries his own decaying head under his arm, its eyes darting about with supernatural sight to seek out its next victim. In some tales, he wields a whip made from a human spine and drives a coach constructed from bones and skin. Folklore suggests he may be the lingering spirit of the ancient Celtic god Crom Dubh, who demanded sacrifices by decapitation before the arrival of Christianity. In contrast, German folklore presents a more morally complex figure, often tied to the broader myth of the wild hunt. Germany's headless riders are frequently revenants, the ghosts of wicked men who are condemned to wander the earth until they atone for their crimes. But unlike their Celtic equivalent, these spirits aren't always malevolent, with many of them being forced to do good deeds as a form of penance. In some versions of this legend, only when they've repaid their debt to society can they be made whole again and rest peacefully. Some versions of Der Kopfloser Reiter, as they're known in German, act as supernatural guardians, sounding a hunting horn to warn travelers of impending danger. Other times they appear and scare hunters, preventing them venturing out when they believe they'll meet tragedy that day. Still other times they are sent to hound down outlaws, serving as enforcers of a moral order they defied in their own lives. The Headless Horseman rode into the American consciousness and into global fame in 1820 with Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving, a master storyteller, didn't invent the figure but brilliantly adapted it, creating a uniquely American ghost. While living in England, he absorbed European folklore, drawing heavily from German tales of ghostly hunters he likely learned about through his friendship with Sir Walter Scott. Irving's genius was to take this old-world phantom and anchor it in the soil and history of the New World. He set his story in the Hudson Valley, a region he knew intimately, and populated it with characters bearing the names of real local Dutch families. This led to his fiction having a chilling air of authenticity. Most importantly, Irving gave his horsemen a specific historical identity: the ghost of a Hessian trooper decapitated by a cannonball during the American Revolutionary War. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British, and they were widely feared by the American colonists, making them a perfect choice for a ghost that resonated nationally. Notably, the Headless Horseman himself appears to be based in real, authentic history, as evidenced by something that happened during the Battle of White Plains in October 1776. This location, which is less than 10 miles from the real Sleepy Hollow, featured a Hessian horseman who took a cannonball straight to the dome. And spoiler alert, in case you haven't read about this battle yet, the horseman didn't make it. Irving transformed this brutal footnote into the origin story for America's greatest ghost. What makes Irving's story so enduring, however, is its profound ambiguity. He never confirms if the horseman is a genuine specter or simply Ichabod Crane's rival, the brawny Brom Bones, in a clever disguise. The discovery of a shattered pumpkin near Ichabod's abandoned hat strongly suggests a prank, though this is ultimately left fairly ambiguous. Beyond any single story, the Headless Rider haunts us because he taps into a primal and universal set of fears. At its most basic level, the horror is biological. Decapitation is an absolute, unhealable wound that severs the mind, the seat of identity, reason, and consciousness, from the body. A body that can still act, ride, and hunt without a head is a profound violation of the natural order. It represents the terrifying triumph of chaotic, mindless impulse over rational control. This perhaps taps into our deep-seated fear of losing our own minds and becoming subject to forces we can't comprehend. In this way, I personally find that it has some passing resemblance to the mythology we've built up around zombies. The Headless Horseman is a powerful and adaptable archetype all over the Western world, and scholars still struggle to identify why the archetype is so widespread. He's not one ghost, but a legion, reshaped by each culture to carry the weight of its history and its fears. In a quarry in Oberkassel, Germany, back in 1914, workers stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried deep in the earth for 14,000 years were the skeletons of a man, a woman, and nestled beside them, a dog. This wasn't just a random assortment of bones. It was a deliberate, double human burial that included an animal. This find, now known as the Bonn Oberkassel dog, represents the earliest undisputed evidence of a domesticated dog, a final chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for millennia. But the most poignant part of this story isn't just the dog's age. It's a secret hidden in its teeth. Paleopathological analysis revealed that as a puppy, this animal had suffered from and, against all odds, survived a severe case of canine distemper. This disease is brutal, often fatal, and would have left the young dog incapacitated for weeks. Its survival would have been nearly impossible without intensive human care. Someone had to bring it food and water, keep it warm, and clean up after it. This act of compassion, offered to a sick animal that provided no immediate practical benefit, powerfully suggests that this was no mere tool or beast of burden. This was a pet. For decades, scientists have been locked in a fierce debate over when and where this revolutionary partnership between humans and dogs began. The timeline itself is a moving target, a puzzle created by the different stories told by bones and by genes. The archaeological record, which relies on physical remains, gives us a conservative estimate. The earliest confirmed dog-like fossils, like the one at Bonn Oberkassel, date to around 15,000 years ago. Yet, the genetic record, which uses the molecular clock to estimate when two lineages diverged, pushes the timeline much deeper into the past. These studies suggest that the ancestors of dogs and wolves split anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. One compelling hypothesis points to Siberia around 23,000 years ago, during the brutal peak of the last glacial maximum. The logic is that the harsh climate would have isolated human and wolf populations, forcing them into closer contact and potentially kick-starting the domestication process. The geographic puzzle has been just as contentious. For years, the debate was a scientific tug-of-war between Europe and Asia. Team Europe pointed to the hard evidence. The oldest archaeological finds were consistently unearthed there, from Germany to Belgium to Spain. Team Asia, on the other hand, relied on genetics. Studies of modern dogs consistently found the greatest genetic diversity in East and Central Asia. This usually indicates an origin point where a population has had the longest time to evolve. For a long time, these two lines of evidence seemed irreconcilable. However, scientists released a new study in 2016, which seemed to indicate both sides were at least somewhat right. By analyzing the complete genome of a 4,800-year-old dog from Ireland and comparing it to dozens of other ancient canids, researchers discovered a deep genetic split. The dogs from East Asia and Europe and Western Eurasia were less genetically similar than initially thought. Crucially, this split appeared to have happened after the first dog showed up in the archaeological record in both places. This led to the revolutionary dual domestication hypothesis, that dogs were domesticated not once, but twice, independently, on opposite sides of the Eurasian continent. The theory suggests that the original European dogs were later largely replaced by a wave of Asian dogs that migrated westward alongside humans. This brilliant model resolves the central conflict, explaining why the oldest bones are in Europe, while the greatest modern genetic diversity traces back to Asia. Understanding where and when this happened is only part of the puzzle, and perhaps the deeper mystery is how it happened. The dominant theory for years has been the commensal scavenger hypothesis, a story of self-domestication, often called survival of the friendliest. In this scenario, wolves essentially chose us first. The narrative suggests that some ancient wolves were naturally bolder and less fearful than their peers, allowing them to approach human hunter-gatherer camps. This created a new evolutionary niche where friendliness became a powerful selective advantage. The tamer wolves got more food and were tolerated, while the more aggressive or fearful ones were driven off or just outright eaten themselves. Over countless generations, this relentless selection for a single behavioral trait, what scientists have termed tameability, triggered a cascade of unintended physical and hormonal changes. These wolves went from looking like apex predators to having cute floppy ears, friendly puppy dog eyes that look very human, and wagging their tails. In this view, humans were relatively passive actors, simply providing the environment in which wolves domesticated themselves. However, this elegant theory has faced growing criticism. For one, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were highly nomadic. It's unlikely they stayed in one place long enough to create the massive permanent garbage dumps needed to sustain a dependent wolf population. Furthermore, wolves are apex predators, not natural scavengers, and their instinct is to maintain a significant flight distance from humans, who are also apex predators. A bold wolf approaching a camp full of human competitors would likely have been viewed as a dangerous threat, not a potential friend. This has led to an alternative theory, one that places human agency and emotion at the center of the story: the orphan puppy hypothesis. Drawing from observations of modern hunter-gatherer groups who often capture and raise wild animals, this theory claims that our ancestors actively brought pups into their communities. A wolf pup raised by humans during its critical socialization window can form an unbreakable bond. By repeatedly selecting the friendliest and most cooperative pups from these litters to raise and breed, humans would have taken a much more direct and intentional role. This model aligns far better with the emotional evidence from the Bonn Oberkassel burial, where a sick puppy was clearly nurtured with great care. Had the hunter-gatherer who had the sick puppy simply viewed the young dog as a tool, it's unlikely that it would have been nurtured to such an extent. However it began, the process of domestication fundamentally remade the wolf. The selection for tameness unleashed a cascade of changes known as domestication syndrome. As proto-dogs evolved, they developed shorter snouts, smaller teeth, reduced body size, and the now familiar floppy ears and wagging tails. These traits are thought to be byproducts of altering the genes that control fear and aggression. Genetic comparisons between modern dogs and wolves reveal major differences in genes related to brain function and neurochemistry. Dogs possess genetic variations linked to hypersocial behavior in a region of the genome that is associated with extreme trust and friendliness to a fault. The reason they're called man's best friend is, of course, because dogs are very pure-hearted animals and will almost always love their owners unconditionally. This genetic rewiring created a new kind of social intelligence, When faced with a puzzle they can't solve, wolves will persist, trying to figure it out on their own. Dogs, on the other hand, do something remarkable. They quickly turn and look to a nearby human for guidance. They evolved to be exquisitely attuned to our social cues, our gaze, our gestures, with a skill that surpasses even that of chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives. They effectively traded some of their ancestors' rugged independence for a revolutionary new strategy: cooperative problem solving with us. For thousands of years, this partnership continued to evolve, with humans unconsciously selecting dogs for utility, creating hardy animals adapted for herding, guarding, or hunting. But the second, and far more dramatic phase of their evolution began just a couple centuries ago. Spurred by an interest in pets during the 19th century, breeders began to methodically select for form over function, creating hundreds of the distinct breeds we see today. On a clear, sunny morning in March 1876, residents of rural Bath County, Kentucky witnessed one of the strangest downpours in history. It was a shower of meat falling from the sky. Around 11 on March 3rd, a farmer's wife named Mrs. Crouch was outdoors making soap when she suddenly saw chunks of raw flesh plummet to the ground around her. For a few minutes, pieces of bloody meat, some as light as snowflakes, others several inches across, rained over the Crouch farm, sticking to fences and grass in a broad area. Stunned and frightened, the Crouches suspected this uncanny deluge might be a divine omen or supernatural warning. By the time this bizarre Kentucky meat shower ended, it had strewn the ground with what looked like butcher's scraps across their farm. The farmers initially thought that the meat was beef, but they decided to take it over to a local butcher. The butcher in turn said that it definitely wasn't beef, and that while it looked like mutton, it didn't smell like it at all. A hunter, catching word of what had happened, asked to inspect the meat, and came to the conclusion that it was from a bear. Word of mouth about the meat shower was spreading rapidly, and it would soon hit the local news and then go national in the New York Times. From there, the meat shower captured the attention of legitimate scientists, and a number of samples were sent around the country for further analysis. Early explanations for the meat shower ranged from scientific curiosity to the bizarre. One initial hypothesis was that the material wasn't meat at all, but rather dried frog eggs or spawn that had been whisked into the air by winds and then fallen back down. This idea lost traction once microscopic examination revealed organized muscle fibers, which was clear evidence of animal tissue, not amorphous amphibian jelly. Another proposal suggested in a journal article that the meat was actually nostoc, a type of gelatinous algae-like bacteria that can swell into fleshy lumps after rain. However, this theory was quickly undermined by the facts of the case. The meat shower occurred under clear skies with no rain to trigger nostoc, and several scientists found that the samples undeniably had the cellular structure of animal flesh. In short, whatever fell on the Crouch farm was genuine meat, not a plant or pond slime masquerading as meat. As more samples arrived at laboratories, researchers began to characterize exactly what kind of meat had fallen and from where. Before long, investigators arrived at a plausible answer. The leading theory is that the meat had fallen from the stomachs of vultures flying overhead. Bath County was home to scavenging birds like turkey vultures, and these birds are notorious for vomiting their food as a defensive tactic or when they need to lighten their load. In fact, if one vulture in a flock regurgitates, it can trigger a chain reaction causing its companions to disgorge as well. In 1876, local experts pointed out that this buzzard blast scenario neatly fit the evidence. A flock of vultures might have been feasting on a dead animal, say a sheep, which would explain the mutton-like smell, and then something startled them. The startled birds then collectively regurgitated the half-digested meal mid-flight onto the Crouch farm. The gory payload would then scatter in the wind and fall to the ground as a rain of flesh and organs. Though no one actually saw the birds overhead at the time, the notion that a flock of nauseated vultures caused the incident was considered the most reasonable explanation. Other common explanations at the time focused on it being a supernatural event, or even if it wasn't supernatural, that it was an omen of things to come. And honestly, there's something extremely ominous about a sheep carcass raining down from the sky in bits regardless. I seriously wonder what an augur from Roman antiquity would have had to say about that sort of event. Notably, the meat from this event has been preserved, and as genetic testing improves on degraded specimens, we will one day know the origin of the meat. That, of course, doesn't prove the vulture theory, but it will provide some answer to exactly what animal rained down on the Crouch farm in the late 19th century.